Hello, everyone. My name's Greg. Today I'm going to be discussing the SAT, what to expect, and why it matters. So I find a lot of people coming into the SAT have a lot of questions. The SAT takes up a big space in our pop culture. Everyone's heard of it, but some of the specifics aren't as present in most people's conception of it. So that's what we're going to get into today. So the SAT, what I want you to walk away with from this presentation. I want you to have a plan of how to beat the SAT. I want you to walk away knowing more about the SAT than you did before, and I want you to have confidence about your upcoming exam. So those are our three goals in the discussion we're going to have today. So we're going to start off, we're going to talk about kind of a little bit of the history, we're going to get into the content and the setup and the format of the test, and then we're going to get into strategies, how to best approach, how to beat the test. So let's start with what the SAT is. So this is kind of a big question, unintentionally. So one way we can answer it is by looking at the name. So originally, it was the Scholastic Aptitude Test. Then it became the Scholastic Assessment Test. Then it was split into the SAT-1 Reasoning Test and the SAT-2 Subject Test, collectively called the Scholastic Assessment Test. Then it was officially acknowledged that the SAT didn't have an exact acronym, didn't stand for anything specific. So this kind of open-ended naming can often kind of be confusing for people, but we also see these changes in their content. So for example, when it first started, they covered definitions, arithmetic, classification, artificial language, antonyms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can see an example question here from the first test, very different from what you're going to see on the exam. And this changed every few years. They would change the number of sections. They would change how it's scored. They would change the content. The math section was eliminated and brought back multiple times over the course of its existence. But our most recent edition of the SAT comes in 2016. So I wanted to discuss the SAT and its history because it is a very intimidating presence in our academic understanding, at least in America, that it exists and it's a big exam and it's intimidating. But we can see from these changes that have occurred throughout its existence that it's kind of hard to nail down. So the one thing that's consistent throughout the SAT's existence is that it's a barrier. It functions as a barrier. It's a tool to tell who is in, who gets accepted, who moves on, and who is out. So based on that consistent principle, we can work around that. We can work around this barrier to beat it. So getting into the current edition of the SAT. So this is important to know. This is what you guys are going to be seeing on the exam. So some changes that were made. The vocabulary that occurs on the test that comes up that you're tested on becomes a little bit more applicable. So they're not just trying to use words that no one knows or that are rarely used. They're trying to use words that are used in higher levels of academia. So words that you'll see in college courses. So things like synthesis and empirical. The essay, which had previously been mandatory, is now optional. It's also a separate score. So it is not part of your 1,600-point score for your other sections. The guessing penalty is eliminated. That is going to be a very important topic when we get to strategy later. So you are not penalized for incorrect answers. The 1,600-point scale for scoring, as I mentioned earlier, you get an 800 scaled score for reading and an 800 scaled score for math. The essay, as I mentioned, has a separate score. The three math areas, which we'll cover in more detail later, fall in the general category of linear equations, complex equations or functions, and then ratios, percentages, and proportional reasoning. It's a little bit more detailed. We'll get to that later. The reading and writing section, the source material, so the passages that you have to read from, cover a broad range of disciplines. So that's the SAT trying to make it more applicable to what you'll see in college. We'll discuss those disciplines later. And the reading passages, several of them are going to be of historical relevance to the United States. So that's the passages you have to read on the reading section, the writing and language section, and then on the essay portion as well. So these are the things you're going to see in that current edition. This is what it looks like now. So we're going to keep getting into kind of some more details of the setup of this current edition of the test. So the timing. So you'll walk in, you'll register for the exam, you'll give them your ticket, you'll show them your ID, etc. They'll walk you into your exam room, give you an assigned seat, you'll do the instructions. Then when you begin the exam, you go 65 minutes. That is your English reading section. Then you get a 10-minute break. You go into the English writing and language section. Then you go straight in to the math without a calculator section. So the English writing section is 35 minutes, and you go straight in to the 25-minute math without calculator section. Then you get a 5-minute break. So on both of these first breaks, you're allowed to get up, go into the hall, grab water, a snack, whatever you need. Obviously, you're not allowed to use devices or whatever restrictions they'll put in place. Once that 5-minute break is over, you come back and you do the math without calculator section. It's 55 minutes. At this point, students that are not taking the essay, so the essay is optional as we discussed, so students that are not taking it are allowed to leave. They're done with the exam. Students that are taking the essay have a 2-minute break in their seats. They're not allowed to get up. They're not allowed to go into the hall. And then they begin the essay, which is 50 minutes long. So this is a breakdown of the timing of what the exam is going to look like. We'll get into kind of the use of time later with our strategies. But let's start with our reading section. What is the breakdown of the reading section? So in those 65 minutes, you have 52 questions. So that breaks down to roughly 75 seconds per question. Your passages that you're going to see, you're going to have 4 individual passages. So one passage, then questions, and you're going to have one set of paired passages. So 2 passages, questions about both of them. Each passage is going to be 500 to 750 words long, roughly. The paired passages are going to be that length combined. So they'll be roughly half the length of a regular passage on their own. At least one passage will be accompanied by a graphic. So that is a line graph, a data table, a pie chart, scatter plot, anything that shows data. So that kind of is the SAT attempting to incorporate scientific reasoning and understanding into their reading section. The passages that you're going to see, those topics that we mentioned earlier, one of your passages will be US or world literature. So that is going to be fiction. That's the only fiction you're going to see on this exam. So that's going to come in the reading section. You're going to have 2 history or social studies passages. You're going to have 2 hard science passages. So hard science being biology, chemistry, geology, anything like that, as opposed to social studies, which is a little less rigid in their discussion. So this is the breakdown of the reading section. We can see from our examples in these images, the setup of the reading section. You go passage, then question. So it's first passage, then the questions, which is different from our setup on our next section, the writing and language section. As we can see here, the setup for the writing and language section, we have the passage concurrent with our questions. They are next to each other. So the writing and language section, you have 44 questions and 35 minutes. So that is roughly 47 seconds per question. This is the least amount of time you have per question on the test. Each question is passage-based and multiple choice. So as we can see in our example here, there are underlined portions of this passage, and your choices will be about editing those portions. And then on some questions, they just specify what you are changing or editing. So it's not always an underlined portion. So your 4 passages that you'll see on the writing and language are 44 questions are equally split with 11 questions per passage. The topics they're going to cover are careers, social studies, humanities, and science. It's all nonfiction. You're not going to have any literature like we saw on the reading section. You will have 1 or more data interpretation questions. They're very similar to what you see on the reading. The question types, they break down, the official terms are expression of ideas and standard English conventions. I often refer to them as rules-based questions. So grammar, sentence structure, punctuation, where there's a rule for each question, and rhetoric-based questions. So that would be our expression of ideas. That's about developing arguments, supporting details, stuff like that. So we'll get into kind of the distinction between those 2 types of questions and what to do about them later. Okay, so those rules-based questions that I talked about, the standard English conventions, this is a list of those rules. There are 18 of them. If you know all 18, You will be able to respond to any type of question they give you, obviously giving some room for practice, being familiar with the testing format, etc. But they break down into sentence structure, conventions of usage, and conventions of punctuation. So sentence structure, recognizing and correcting sentence formation. So you'll be editing these sentences, forming them into the correct placement and structure. Conventions of usage, so that's about, is the appropriate word used in the appropriate place? And then conventions of punctuation, obviously that's about utilizing punctuation in an appropriate manner. So this will be useful to review all of these rules. If you're not familiar with them, then this is a great resource to kind of take a look at and study from. The rules-based questions can be very difficult if you do not know the rules. However, the simple kind of solution to that is to learn those rules. The rhetoric-based questions don't have as simple of a solution because it requires a little bit more in-depth thinking and reasoning. So having this list available is really useful in studying for that half of the questions that you're going to see. Okay, moving on to the math sections. We have two math sections, as we discussed earlier. We have a no calculator section, which comes first. We have a calculator section, which comes next. So our math section is split into two different types of questions, two formats of questions. You answer them in different ways. First format is the regular multiple choice. You'll have 4 options to choose from in order to answer your question, like you see on all the other sections of the test, except for the essay, obviously. We also have grid-in questions. So you can see in the bottom image on the left part of the screen here, those are instructions for filling out your grid-in answers. So you will have to solve this problem independently and grid in the value of your answer, whether it's a decimal, a fraction, a whole number, whatever. You do not have multiple answers to choose from. And make this a little bit more difficult or intimidating because there's not really a safety net. There's no guessing option, but we will get to that on our strategy portion of how we can work around it. So in our 2 sections, the no calculator section and the calculator section. The no calculator section is 25 minutes long. You have 15 multiple choice questions and 5 grid-in questions. So 20 questions in total. Calculator section is 55 minutes. You have 30 multiple choice questions and 8 grid-in questions, so 38 questions in total. So across both of these math sections, a little bit more than a third is going to be the heart of algebra types of questions. We're going to get into kind of what makes up these question types in a second. A little less than a third is passport to advanced math. Then again, a little less than a third, problem solving and data analysis. And then roughly 10%, very few questions, are additional topics in math. Also, I wanted to mention the reference sheet. You can see in the top image here, this is a reference sheet. It will be available on both the no calculator section and the calculator section. So this is the only information they give you to work with. We can see by looking at it, it's a lot of geometry information, a lot of volume equations, then it also discusses degrees and radians. So unfortunately, this information is not applicable to a lot of the questions that come up, but since we can see what is available to us, you know what resources you'll be working with. So on the no calculator and the calculator, this is the breakdown of kind of the distribution of questions. Now let's get into what those question types or topic groups look like. So let's start with heart of algebra. So this is the description that College Board provides to us, what you'll have to do with these types of questions. I've highlighted here their repeated use of the word linear expression, linear inequality. Everything is linear. So you're not going to see any exponents, you're not going to see any radicals, you're not going to see anything like that. It will all be based around, we can see under topics to know, linear equations. Some form of y equals some form of x. Usually you can put it into the form y equals mx plus b, where m is slope or rate of change, and b is the y-intercept. So that will also take the form of inequalities, where y will be greater than, less than, or greater than or equal to, less than or equal to some version of x. But again, it will be linear. So this is kind of our baseline of algebra, which will get more complicated on our other sections, but things to know, things that you need to know for these types of questions. How to calculate slope. So rise over run, that's kind of the common way to refer to it. So vertical change of our graph or horizontal change. If you want the official formula, it is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, where we have 2 points, x1, y1, and x2, y2. Additionally, you'll need to know the midpoint formula. This one doesn't come up as often, but if you don't know it, it can be more difficult. So then you would have the sum of your x values divided by 2. Then you'd have the sum of your y values divided by 2, and that will give you the x and y value of your midpoint between those 2 points. Additionally, the distance formula. So if you're not familiar with this, this is very useful on any questions where to calculate distance. It can also be utilized in questions where it's asking you something tangential, but you can use it as a stepping stone to get to that answer. So that is the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So that is kind of, if you're aware, the Pythagorean theorem rearranged so that our hypotenuse of our right triangle is the distance between 2 points. But these formulas and these topics you absolutely need to know for this group of questions approaching our linear equations and inequalities. So that's our first group of questions. Here are some examples. So these kind of fall roughly into our easy part of algebra questions, medium, and hard. So our easy questions are pretty straightforward. We can see if a line passes through a certain point, has this slope, what point does it have to pass through? If we have this linear equation and this value, or this variable is a certain value, what does our other variable have to be? And then solving systems of equations where we have to use a method like substitution. So those are our easy questions. Moving on to our medium questions. These might involve something more in terms of identifying in a real world scenario. For example, in our question 15 here, renting a boat, what would be the components of our linear formula? What would this be if we're talking about it in real world terms? So that requires a little bit more interpretation, real world understanding of how we apply mathematics. So that can be a little bit more difficult, require a little bit more complex thinking. Moving on to our hard questions. So these usually require multiple steps, multiple moments of interpretation and problem solving. So these, we'll get to kind of how we use our understanding of easy, medium, and hard later, but this comes in handy being able to assess how difficult or time consuming a question is going to be when we get to our strategic elements later on. So these are some examples of our heart of algebra problems. Our next group of, or our next topic area, passport to advanced math. So this is kind of the step up algebraically. This is now, we're leaving linear equations, we're moving on to quadratic equations, we're moving on to exponential functions, we're moving on to radicals, square roots, cube roots, etc. Polynomial expressions all factor into our passport to advanced math. So things that you need to know for the passport to advanced math questions. Being able to identify the quadratic equation format, so that being ax squared plus bx plus c, very useful. They're not going to have any questions where they just ask you to identify it, but once you start to recognize when that comes up, you can start using our other tools based around that. For example, and this is an absolute must for this exam, knowing the quadratic formula. So if we have an equation in that format of ax squared plus bx plus c, we can find the value of x by using this formula. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That is incredibly useful for this group of questions. So I highly suggest memorizing that, because as we saw on the reference sheet, it is not made available to you. So additionally, knowing the quadratic discriminant. So our portion of that formula where it says b squared minus 4ac. So if we use that whenever that quadratic format comes up, we can tell how many solutions this equation will have. So when we plug in our B value, our A value, and our C value, if D is equal to 0, we're going to have one solution. If D is greater than 0, we have two solutions. If D is less than 0, we have no solutions. So that is useful. That's going to come up on some questions where you have to calculate the number of solutions for a certain equation in that quadratic format. Also necessary to know is the vertex format of a quadratic equation. So that being y is equal to a times x minus h squared plus k. So this is a formula for a parabola, just like a quadratic equation, but it is arranged in a way that our vertex, the x and y values of our vertex are components, are numbers that occur in this equation. So knowing that format, being able to recognize it, and being able to reformat a quadratic equation into that vertex format, it's going to be really useful for calculating the vertex, but also recognizing that you can find the vertex from that format as well. So, Passport to Advanced Math, this is where we get into our quadratic, exponential equations, polynomial expressions, things of that nature. A lot of the question types, what they're asking you to do, very similar to, Heart of Algebra, just using this more complicated set of equation types. So, some examples from Passport to Advanced Math. Again, we can kind of see easy, medium, and hard. They don't fall exactly into these categories, but it's a good general categorization. So our easy questions, these are something like combining terms. So we know x squared terms, we have to add to other x squared terms. This is things like plugging in values into an equation to get an output. Fairly straightforward, just basic understandings of what these equations mean and how we use them together. Our medium questions. This, again, requires a little bit more interpretation, a little bit more understanding of what we have to do. So, for example, in 25, we have a word problem, a real-world scenario. We have to use an exponential equation to solve for a real-world value, the number of seconds for a ball to hit the ground. So we have to understand what this equation means, what that value, that concept of the ball hitting the ground is going to look like in terms of the math that we need to do to solve, and then we have to solve from there. The process is usually a little bit more straightforward, but the interpretation requires a few steps maybe. Number 30, for example, here we are using the vertex format, right? Our question is, what is our form from which the coordinates of vertex A can be identified as constants in the equation. So that's where we have to know our vertex format, how we can rearrange this equation that they give us to find the vertex of that parabola. So these are kind of our medium questions. Moving on to our hard questions. So this involves several steps for problem solving, an intimate understanding of kind of the format of the equation we're working with. So this is where recognizing quadratic formats of an equation comes in very useful. So we can see on the right side of our equation, we've got a quadratic format. We've got an ax squared plus bx plus c. We can see on the other side, this polynomial expression, if we multiply it, it's going to be in that same format. So once we know that they're equal to each other, we can match our coefficients together. So that description sounds a little bit complicated, but that's what our very hardest questions are going to be looking like in Passport to Advanced Math. Okay, so our next group of problems, our next topic area is going to be problem solving and data analysis. So this is a little bit more real world. This involves kind of real world scenarios of things like interest and scientific experiments and data. Absolutely 100% necessary to know. Mean, median, mode, range, and standard deviation. They're going to use these terms without explanation. You are not going to be provided them on the reference sheet. You will have to understand what they are referring to when they ask you about them without being able to refer to anything else. So mean, calculating our average. So whatever terms they give us, we add them all together, we divide by the number of terms. That is how we calculate mean. Median being the middle value when our values are in order. We line them all up in order, pick the one right in the middle, that's our median value. Mode, easy way to remember, mode is most. Mode happens the most. There's our most commonly reoccurring value. Range, that's the difference between our greatest and least value. And standard deviation. This one doesn't come up as much because it's a little bit more of a complicated concept, but it's one a lot of students struggle with because it is a little bit more complicated. So when that comes up, essentially this measures the spread of our data. We take the average distance of our data from the mean. So the more spread out everything is, if everything is far apart, we're going to have a much higher standard deviation. If it is all packed together, very close around the average, that's going to be a much lower standard deviation. So that concept, just understanding it's how spread out the data is useful for conceiving it. It doesn't get much more complicated than that, but it is necessary to know what they're referring to. Additionally, necessary to know the difference between compound interest and simple interest. So, fairly straightforward way of remembering it. Compound interest is exponential. It's building on itself each year. Simple interest is linear, right? So simple interest is the simpler version. It's linear. It's going to be the same change each year. So these, absolutely necessary to know, are concepts that are going to be tested in the problem solving and data analysis topic group. Ratios, rates, proportional relationships. We're going to be working with percentages, measurement quantities, units, converting between units. You'll also have some kind of general, more science-based questions where you'll have to interpret data collection methods. Those aren't particularly common questions, but they will come up. You have to understand what makes appropriate data for certain findings. You'll be comparing linear growth with exponential growth, summarizing categorical data. You'll have to make inferences about populations, use statistics, the measurements we just discussed, and also, as we mentioned, data collection methods. So these questions, these problem solving and data analysis questions, usually involve a little bit more in terms of word problems, real world scenarios, and interpretation. So let's look at some examples. All right, so again, you have the breakdown of easy, medium, and hard questions. Easy question. So these are just kind of basic interpretation of a graph or understanding things like a negative correlation in a scatter plot. So fairly straightforward. There are some things we need to know. For example, what is negative correlation? How do we read a scatter plot? What do the variables signify here? Same with number one. Reading the graph, understanding that context they're giving us, how that plays in, interpreting the question, knowing what we're looking for. But the content behind it, the mathematical content, fairly straightforward. Moving on to our medium questions. So this usually involves a few more steps, might be a little bit more time consuming, where we're calculating things like mean, median, range, or we have to convert between multiple different units, where it just might be a little bit more time consuming. You have to do a little bit more planning so you understand the steps you're going to take to find that solution. Then our hard questions, those usually involve fairly detailed scenarios where you really have to take time to understand what steps you're going through to get your solution. It can be, those questions can often be difficult for students just to understand what they're doing. But again, that content is going to be what we just discussed. There's not going to be anything that goes beyond what we just looked at. So the content's never going to be harder than what we just discussed. It's more in terms of interpreting our questions and our scenarios and how we apply those questions, or pardon me, those concepts. So now we get to our last group of topics, which is additional topics in math. So additional topics in math, as we discussed, roughly 10% of the questions, they don't come up very often. However, these come up often in our grid-in portion, which I mentioned earlier. We don't have that safety net. We don't have the ability to guess or choose from our multiple choice answers. So these can be a little trickier. However, as we can see here in the discussion of what these cover, volume formulas, Pythagorean theorem, degrees and radians, theorems about circles, they involve a lot of the geometric concepts that are made available to you on your reference sheet. So those come in handy on a lot of these additional topics in math questions. However, there are topics that are not on that reference sheet that it will be necessary to know. So things like complex numbers. So that's where a real number paired with an imaginary number. Arc length, being able to calculate that, which we'll discuss in a second. Theorems about circles, understanding congruence and similarity, and being able to calculate sine, cosine, and tangent. So looking at topics to know. SOHCAHTOA, the mnemonic device for understanding sine, cosine, and tangent. That understanding of it is as far as you will need to know besides applying it, but we're not going to get into anything like cotangent or secant or cosecant. SOHCAHTOA is as far as you will need to know, but understanding that and applying that is going to be really important on these types of questions. Understanding similarity and congruence. So similarity being the same shape that is different sizes, congruence being the exact same shape, the exact same size. Being able to determine that from information given, that is kind of an added step of complexity, but understanding those concepts, how you can use them, is important as well. So transversals and vertical angles, that comes into play with similarity and congruence. So being able to prove that two angles at an intersection are equal or that they're supplementary or complementary, that comes in very handy for those types of questions. Understanding the conjugate in application to our complex numbers, how you can use it to simplify complex numbers in a fraction. Our Pythagorean theorem, which I mentioned earlier, as a version of our distance formula. So just when we have a right triangle, a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared when c is our hypotenuse. So our other side squared equal to our hypotenuse squared. A theorem that comes up very often, is very useful to know, is our complementary angle theorem. So if x degrees plus y degrees is equal to 90 degrees, if it's equal to a right angle, then the sine of one angle is equal to the cosine of the other, and vice versa. Then our next topic to know is about finding arc length, finding sector area, where the ratio, the arc length over the circumference, or the sector area over the area of a circle, angles and degrees over 360, angles and radians over 2 pi, those are always going to be equal. They're always, that part over the corresponding whole, always going to be equal. So if you have that memorized, you can just fill in that information and solve for whatever's missing. Additionally, really useful to know is the circle equation. So this is the equation we use to graph a circle. So that's x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared, where hk is our center and r is our radius. So if you can rearrange whatever equation they give you into that format, you can already find the center of the circle and the radius, which is a type of question that will come up. So again, these questions are a little bit more difficult, a little bit more complicated. Oftentimes, if you ever kind of see some clickbait posts about this is the hardest SAT question, blah, 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 they'll fall into this category. However, we know that they only make up 10% of the test. So we'll be getting into kind of how we can best prioritize our time once we get to the strategy portion. But this is some examples of the additional topics in math questions. So we can see for our easy questions, we have imaginary numbers. So what is the sum of these these complex numbers? We're using I, square root of -1. So here you just have to know when you add complex numbers, we're just adding real numbers with real numbers, imaginary numbers with imaginary numbers. Moving on to number 3. That's where our understanding of intersections and transversals, proving certain angles are congruent or equal to each other, that comes into play for number 3. Our medium questions, that's where we have to apply things like similarity and congruence, and our volume formulas. So understanding how we apply that in real world scenarios. A little bit more complicated. Now we're using that information, having to do a little bit more problem solving. Then our hard questions. This is where our problem solving really has to kind of take over. We're applying information, but also we have to figure out what steps we have to take to get to that final answer. So this is a rough breakdown of kind of what an easy, a medium, and hard additional topics in math question might look like. Okay, so those were our math content groups. So we've covered the reading section, we've covered the writing and language section, we've covered the math sections. We know like the breakdown, the format, the content. So now we're going to transition into our strategic discussion. So I'd like to use an illustrative example, the Fosbury flop. So in the 1968 Summer Olympics, this man named Dick Fosbury, he was competing in the high jump. The time the high jump, the kind of consensus, the general understanding of how you do the high jump was you jump over forwards. So you have to jump straight up and flip yourself over. That requires a lot of muscle. So high jumpers were kind of big guys, a lot of muscle. Dick Fosbury, as we can kind of see here, is a bit lankier. However, he was a civil engineering student. He had the same opportunity to train. He had the same equipment as everyone else, but he put his civil engineering understanding to application in his high jump. And he went over the bar backwards, completely against kind of the usual understanding of how to do it. And he walked away with an Olympic record and a gold medal. So this example, I like to take away from this that training is important, equipment is necessary, but our approach and our strategy, that can put us over the top. That can really give you a great score. So that approach, going over the bar backwards, that's what we're going to talk about right now. So our mantra we can take away from this is know the test, practice the test, beat the test. Knowing the test, that's what we just talked about. We understand the content, we understand the format. Knowing what you're going to see, that's our first step. Practicing the test, that's something that comes next. That's where you just put in the hard work, you familiarize yourself, you build your confidence. Beating the test, that's what we're going to talk about now. How can we outsmart this exam, this barrier, like we discussed earlier? How can we get over it? How can we beat it at its own game? Know the test, practice the test, beat the test. So beating the test, that's what we're going to talk about right now. So the foundations of our SAT strategy are the fact that there is a limited amount of time, the questions have consistent structure, and all questions are the same amount in terms of point value. So from this, we can take away our general strategy, and that's the STG strategy of skip, triage, guess. Skip, triage, guess essentially boils down to we want to skip over questions we can't do immediately, right? If you come to a question and you don't know the answer or don't know the steps you have to take to get the answer, as soon as you get there, you're going to skip it and come back to it. Triaging questions, that's where we want to emphasize your strengths. So that's where understanding kind of our breakdown of our easy, medium, and hard questions, our content areas, that's where that comes in, into play. If you know, for example, on the writing section, that you're really good at punctuation questions, you're really good at the rules-based questions, you want to do those first. You can get those out of the way, and all the time you would have spent working on questions that maybe you weren't sure about or maybe you have a little bit harder time with, you're devoting to putting points in the bank. Because you know you're good at that, you want to do that first, you want to put those points in the bank, you can spend your time a little bit more freely on questions that need it a little bit more, things that maybe you're not as confident with. So that's where triaging your questions, you play to your strengths, and guessing. So the worst thing you could do on the SAT, the worst possible score you could get, is to leave everything blank. If you didn't look at a single question and you filled in everything randomly, if you guessed randomly on every question, you would do better than if you left it blank because there's no guessing penalty. So we can build our strategy around, in the worst case scenario, you can guess because on those multiple choice questions, you have 4 options. You have a 1 in 4 shot of guessing correctly. So when we're skipping questions, when we're triaging questions, when we're emphasizing your strengths and maybe leaving some other questions out or devoting some more times to certain ones, we know that in the worst case scenario, we can guess on those questions we left behind and we skipped because the ones you're doing, the ones you're emphasizing, are things you're confident in. You're going to get those points because the other questions which might have diverted your time, you can guess on. So this is our basic setup of our strategy. Skipping certain questions, triaging and emphasizing your strengths, and guessing if we need to. So this, we're going to look at how we apply them on each section of the test. So let's start with the reading section. When we get to the reading section, the passages often take up a lot of time. The common sense way of thinking about it, right? The way that it seems like we should do it is just to read through the passage really dedicate ourselves to looking at all the details, get a really good understanding of it, and then go to the questions. This is the way a lot of students approach it if they're not working strategically. This is the common sense way to do it. However, that often leads to students running out of time, having difficulty focusing, or burning out by the end of the section. So what we can do to work around that, what we can do to build our best strategy here, is to actually start with our questions first. So when you get to a new passage, before you even start reading, you want to start with the questions. So when we read the questions first, you already know what you're going to be looking for. It's going to make you a more effective reader once you get to that passage. If we read the questions first, that's where understanding of kind of what we've seen before, what questions are you better at, what content areas kind of can you emphasize, you can prioritize your questions next. Looking through your questions, you can pick out, I want to do these ones first, these are going to take me more time, these are going to be more difficult, I'll save those for last. So once you've kind of made your plan of attack for your questions, now you can mark up the passage. You want to make yourself notes, you want to underline anything that they reference. So they'll tell you, look on line 15 through 27. You want to underline that. You want to make a note, what question's it for? You want to mark up your entire exam because you're making yourself a cheat sheet. Once you leave those questions, you've already marked down what information is going to be relevant, what information applies to what questions. You're doing the steps before you even get to the reading. So once you see that information, you'll be able to apply it quickly. So once we're reading the questions, once we move on from the questions, we've marked up the passage, now we're reading it, you want to avoid that detailed, laborious, line by line, vigorous reading, because that's going to take time, it's going to take a lot of effort, and it's not going to be the most efficient. You already have your notes written out for you on that passage. You already know what they're asking for in the questions. So you can, when you read through the passage, you can sort of skim it. You don't want to be too light. It's kind of, this is where practice comes in, which we'll discuss later. Practicing this is useful, but you want to look for the information that you highlighted. You want to focus on the information you know is going to be relevant. You want to think about the questions that they're asking. You can find that information, you can answer your questions. So answering the questions, you already have your plan of attack. You know, you're answering your high priority questions first. Those are the ones that you test out. Those are the ones that are going to be simplest to answer. Those are the ones that are going to take you the least amount of time. Then once you move on to the harder questions, you can answer those as well. If you get stuck, you don't know, we know worst case scenario you can guess. However, there are certain structural elements, certain strategies we can use based on our question structure to work around that. So then just a general time-saving tip, when you're working on this, you can work on your test booklet. Once you completed the passage and the questions, you can switch it over to your bubble sheet and fill everything in. That's going to save you time flipping back and forth. So let's look at how we might prioritize certain questions. So some questions that might be good to prioritize. Let's look at 3, 7, and 8. So question 3, as used in line 1 and line 65, directly most nearly means. This is asking us about our vocabulary. We also have specific mentions of line 1 and line 65. So we can immediately be going there, underlining our sentences that use the word directly, circling the word directly, making a note that we are thinking about this word. That means we're probably going to have to read 2 sentences and know our context for that word. It's pretty straightforward. Not a lot of critical thinking, just seeing what definition or what similar word matches with what we saw in those 2 sentences. Looking at number 7, the main purpose of the first paragraph is to. So main purpose question, that's a little bit more critical thinking, but our reading is condensed just to the first paragraph. So that is going to be pretty straightforward. It's probably going to go pretty quickly. Easy to make yourself a note next to the first paragraph that you're looking for the main purpose. So it's going to be pretty straightforward to answer. Looking at number 8, as used in line 2, form most nearly means. So again, line 2, we're immediately underlining that, circling the word form. That's probably going to be pretty quick, pretty direct to answer. So 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, and 10. All of these have specific lines mentioned in them. So question 3, we have lines 1 and 65. Question 4 and question 5, we have the lines in our answer options. Line 33, line 49 through 51, line 63 through 64, line 71 through 72. All of those are things you can be underlining, writing yourself notes about what the questions are asking about, so you know that context and you know what information is going to be relevant. And so 4 and 5, that is a specific format of question where we have a paired evidence question. We'll be discussing how we can use that format to our advantage in a second. 7 and 8, we have specific mentions of area of the text to underline, highlight, whatever. We know what's relevant. 9 and 10, we also know what's relevant. We can see they reference a specific quote. Line 32, that's where we can be looking. And also specific pieces of evidence on certain lines. So we know where we're looking for these questions. It's a little bit more straightforward. They're almost doing the work for us because we already know where we're looking. We know the context of the question. We know we can almost prioritize these based on that. Questions 1 and 2, however, might be ones to save, might be ones to skip and come back. So we can see question 1, which choice best describes what happens in the passage? Question 2, which choice best describes the developmental pattern of the passage? These are about the passage as a whole. So if it's about the passage as a whole, answering our other questions is going to help you develop your understanding of the passage in its entirety. So if you don't do those first, that is going to be more difficult because you haven't looked at the passage, you haven't answered other questions. It's going to be better for you to come back to those after answering the other questions. It's going to take a little bit more time, require a little bit more critical thinking, that the other questions, answering those is going to help you with. So looking at a question like number 6, this is one where we don't have a specific line referenced, but we have something like Kira addressed Chi. These are 2 characters in our passage. So if there are 2 characters in our passage, we can look for where these characters are interacting. That gives us more context. We don't have a specific line, but we can skim through and look, are these characters interacting? Circle the paragraph where that occurs. So we've narrowed it down. We've narrowed down what we have to read significantly to answer a question like this. So these are the considerations that should be going through your head when you approach those questions. Before you even get to the passage, these are the things to be prioritizing, thinking, okay, what questions can I start off with? What is a question that's telling me where to look? How can I attack these in a certain order that's best going to benefit me? So that is kind of how we triage our questions, right? Determine what to skip, how to emphasize our best bets, right? So let's move on to how to answer certain questions. So 4 and 5 I mentioned. So 4 is asking us kind of an interpretive question. What reaction does our character most fear from our other character? So that is a kind of a matter of opinion, but in question number 5, which is attached to it, it's asking us what provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question. So we're limited to those lines in question 5 to look at, to answer our question. That is what we have to work with. So they've narrowed it down significantly. So a question that's a matter of opinion now becomes what is applicable? What of that narrowly defined group of information is applicable to this question? So on a question like 4 and 5, you want to start with the evidence question. So let's look at what our lines have to say. So in option A, his voice was soft and refined. In option B, you know children speak so earnestly, so hurriedly, so endearingly about things that have no importance to an adult's mind. Option C, we have an understanding. Please don't judge my candidacy by the unseemliness of this proposal. Option D, eager to make his point, he'd be looking her full in the face. Abruptly, his voice turned gentle. So we have that information. We've narrowed it down. We want to see what is applicable. So option A, we can eliminate. His voice was soft and refined. That's not telling us anything about fear or intimidate, anything. It's not applicable. Moving on to B, you know how children speak so earnestly. Earnestness is not about fear. So we can eliminate that. Option C, please don't judge my candidacy by the unseemliness of this proposal. seems a little bit maybe not applicable, but we have this phrase in here, please don't. So he's asking for something not to happen. That can be applicable. We'll come back to that. Option D, eager to make his point, he'd been looking her full in the face. Abruptly, his voice turned gentle. Again, we don't have anything about fear. So let's return to option C. We want to look at, from option C, what can we take away? What can we come to as a conclusion? So we can see he's afraid. He's asking, please don't. So that indicates the fear that we're looking for. Judge my candidacy by the unseemliness of my proposal. So unseemliness, that's the thing that he's afraid of. So if we look at what our answer options for 4 are defining, you can see inappropriate, immaturity, that he's being an imposition, or that she's underestimating him. Unseemliness matches pretty exactly with this fear of being inappropriate. So by taking this strategic approach, by looking at our evidence first, by using the lines that they gave us, we can use the structure of the questions against itself. We can see that C and A would be our appropriate answers for this setup of question. So these are the ways you can approach questions strategically that maybe would be a little bit more difficult if we just did the regular straight reading through the passage, straight going through the questions. All right, so let's move on to our writing and language strategy. So let's understand the breakdown of our rhetoric and rules-based questions. So our rhetoric-based questions, so this is things like command of evidence, words and context, expression of ideas. This is going to be roughly 24 of our 44 questions. Our standard English conventions, that's our rules-based questions, are going to be roughly 20 of our 44 questions. So that's sentence structure, usage, punctuation, talked about that earlier. And then you're going to have 2 or 3 data interpretation questions. So you have a little bit of a freer hand to skip questions in this one. You're not limited by passage. As we talked about, it's kind of line-based questions. What is underlined? You're making edits to that. So that's something I suggest you do. You should be skipping through the whole passage, not relegating yourself just to certain passages and going passage by passage, because you have that ability. So that's going to play to your strengths even better. If you get all the questions that you're best at out of the way first. In reading your passage, most questions are sentence by sentence. So those, you don't have to read whole paragraphs usually. You shouldn't be reading more than you have to. So we'll talk about that in a second. However, reading every sentence to completion is important. There's going to be some trick answer options that look correct if you don't read the whole sentence. So identifying your context is a great way to save time, so you're not reading more than you have to. We know that time is important on this section because we have the least amount of time per question, only 47 seconds. So we want to go back to the questions, answer them, and we want to attempt the questions one at a time. That's because our passage has multiple questions in it and we're changing things. So if you change one answer, it's not going to affect the other answer unless the test explicitly states so. So you don't have to worry about if I change one answer, my other answer is going to change. That's not something that occurs on this test unless it is explicitly stated. So let's look at kind of our appropriate context for certain types of questions. So we've got our distinction between our rules-based questions and our rhetoric-based questions. So our rules-based questions, that's going to be our questions that I outlined in red here. So 3, 4, 7, 8, and 11. So this is like 3, it's about punctuation, so is number 4. 7 is about usage, so is number 8. And number 11 is about punctuation. So if we know those rules, that list of 18 rules I showed earlier, you should be able to answer these pretty straightforward. With practice, you'll be able to identify these questions a little bit easier. So you'll almost be able to, off the top of your head, to say, oh, this is testing this certain rule, it's going to look like this. You can answer it a little bit more directly. So when you have a rules-based question, you almost never have to read beyond the sentence that contains it. So that context is pretty limited on what you have to read. Looking at our rhetoric-based questions, so that's 1, 2, 5, 6, 9, and 10. So number 2, for example, which choice provides the most relevant detail? So you probably want to read the question, or you want to read the sentence that's underlined for number 2, obviously, but you also want to read the sentence before and the sentence after. So that would be 3, 4, and 5. looking at question 5. To make this paragraph most logical, sentence 5 should be placed. So since this is asking you about the whole paragraph, you should read the paragraph from the first sentence to the last. Again, because this is why understanding what our question types is important, you never want to do that if you don't have to. However, in this scenario, that's going to be our best option. Moving on to number 6. The writer is considering deleting the underlined sentence. Should the writer do that? So again, you want to read the sentence before, so sentence 5, to the sentence after. So even expanding that to kind of half of a paragraph, that's going to give you context to understand whether something should be deleted or not. Moving on to number 9. Here, we're changing a transition word. So we're choosing between also, in other words, therefore, for instance, to determine what's going to be our best transition. So usually for this kind of question, you just need to read the sentence before and the sentence that contains it, because those are the two ideas you're transitioning between. So once you look at those ideas, you determine how they relate. You can see what transition gives us the appropriate relationship between these two ideas. Moving on to number 10. Here, we're just choosing the appropriate word. What's going to give us the best meaning? So based on that, what's fitting in with the context, that is a little bit more straightforward. We just have to read the sentence that contains it, probably. All right, so this is how we identify the context we use for our writing and language questions. You're a little bit more free to skip around, emphasize your strengths, whether it's rules-based questions or rhetoric-based questions. That's going to save you time. It's going to make you most effective. All right, let's move on to our math strategy. This has a little bit more discussion. So with our math strategy, we're still applying that STG strategy, skipping, triaging, and guessing. When we're skipping through, when we're triaging our questions, it's important to know that there's a progression of difficulty. It goes from the easiest question to the hardest question. So our easiest question is first, usually, and our hardest question is going to be last. So our first multiple choice question is our easiest one, hardest multiple choice question is last. However, we also have those grid-in questions. So those come after our multiple choice. So that restarts, that progression of difficulty restarts. So our hardest multiple choice question is followed by our easiest grid-in question. So this is something to keep in mind when you're skipping through, when you're triaging your questions, is that if you've gone through all the multiple choice questions, you've done all the ones you're comfortable with, you've emphasized your strengths, got those out of the way, instead of going to the very hard multiple choice questions, trying to slog through those and figure those out, you can skip ahead to the grid-in portion and pick up 2 or 3 of the easier ones of those. They're probably going to be easier than the hard multiple choice questions, and you can get those out of the way. So that's something you want to do because A, it's going to be easier, and B, you don't have the option to guess on those. So once time starts to run out, you want to have as many grid-in questions done as possible, because worst comes to worst, you're running out of time, you can guess on the multiple choice, but you can't on the grid-in. So in triaging your questions, important to know all questions are worth an equal amount of points. So don't pick a hard question because you think it's going to be worth more. That's not the case. An easy question is worth just as much as a hard question. Do the easy questions first. Time-consuming questions and difficult questions you want to save and come back to. In approaching those questions, process of elimination is incredibly useful. So 1 or 2 of your answer options is usually going to be obviously wrong. It just cannot work with the setup they've given you. Once you eliminate those, your guessing, even if you have to guess, has improved. Let's say, because there's 4 options, right? If you eliminate 2 of them, you've narrowed it down to a 50-50 chance. There's occasionally going to be scenarios where you eliminate 3 options. You've worked your way to the correct answer without even having to approach the question in a regular way. Things that are going to help you apply process of elimination. That's just reframing the question. So if you have to draw yourself a diagram, if you have to rewrite a word problem, if you have to write yourself an equation, whatever you need, making those changes using those tools, that's going to help with process of elimination on those difficult questions maybe you don't know how to approach. Just toying around with the information they give you is going to get you on the way to seeing what does not fit in. That's a great way to work on a question you don't know where to start. So knowing the question formats is also very useful. So let's take a look. There are certain scenarios where we can use the question format to answer it without even solving it in the usual way. So our example, which we saw earlier, if x minus 1 over 3 equals k and k equals 3, what is the value of x? This is not one of our more difficult questions, but the usual way to solve them would be to rewrite this equation with 3 in the place of k. So we substituted in 3, then solve it algebraically by doing our opposite function. So we would multiply both sides by 3, we would add 1 to both sides, and we'd get our solution. However, we can also kind of invert our process here. So let's say we substitute in 3 for our answer. Now let's plug in our answer, or pardon me, let's substitute in 3 for k. Now let's substitute in our answer options. So A is 2, B is 4, C is 9, D is 10. So if we plug in those numbers for x, we can see option A doesn't work, B doesn't work, C doesn't work. Only D works with the setup they've given us. We do 10 minus 1 over 3, that equals 3. So there are certain scenarios where we can use the answer options they've given us to our advantage. We can use the structure of the question to answer the question itself without working through the usual steps. So let's take another example. This one's a little bit more complicated. So they've given us this scenario. If x is greater than 3, which of the following is equivalent to 1 over x plus 2 plus 1 over x plus 3? So it's a pretty complicated setup. The kind of usual way to do this would be to see what we can rearrange algebraically, kind of guess and check to see how we can figure it out until it's in the same format as one of our answer options. That is kind of a tricky situation because it can be difficult to know where to start. It's easy to go in the wrong direction and get off track. A good way to approach this is, again, to use our answer options. However, we don't have anything to plug in. They haven't given us kind of x equals 3, any scenario like that, like we saw in the previous question. So what we can do here is we can make our own x. We can make our own variable. So they tell us x is greater than 3. That's important. We have to follow the rules they set up for us. So let's say x equals 4. When we plug that into our equation, as you can see here, we work through it, we get 42 over 13. So 42 over 13 is our output. So that means if we're finding the equivalent equation, when we plug in x equals 4, our output has to be 42 over 13. Looking at our answer options, when we plug in to A, C, or D, we don't get that correct output, but when we plug it into option B, we get 42 over 13. Therefore, it has to be the equivalent equation. So this scenario where they've given us this very complicated setup of an equation would probably take a while to figure out how to rearrange it algebraically. We've circumvented that. We've gone around it by using the structure of the question against itself. So being able to recognize these scenarios and use these strategies is going to save you a lot of time, and it's also going to make these difficult questions a lot easier. So process of elimination also comes into play here, where we can see, for example, in our answer options, certain ones aren't even fractions, like C and D. So once we get that output, we know it has to be a fraction, at least, so we could even eliminate C and D before moving on to figure out which one is the appropriate fraction. So all of our strategies can come into play on a complicated question like this to give us the most efficient and effective answering mechanism. Okay, so we've talked about the reading section, we've talked about writing and language, we've also talked about the math section. Let's also talk about the essay. Most students I have don't take the essay. It's not mandatory. If the school you're applying to doesn't require it or doesn't prefer it, I would say skip it because it's one less thing to study for, one less thing to practice. But if you want to do it, if the school that you're applying to wants you to do it, there are ways to do it in the best way possible. So let's talk about our essay. You have 50 minutes to read a passage and write an essay in response to the prompt provided. Okay, so that's their instructions. understanding the prompt is really important because often students kind of misinterpret the prompt, or it's different than the usual essay they're used to writing. So they write the wrong essay for the prompt, and it negatively affects their score. So let's take a look at what the prompt might look like in these two images. As you read the passage below, consider how Jimmy Carter uses evidence, such as facts or examples, to support claims, reasoning to develop ideas to connect claims or evidence, stylistic or persuasive elements, such as word choice or appeals to emotion, add power to the ideas expressed. So these are the things that you're looking for in your essay. How is the author using persuasive techniques, such as providing evidence, showing their reasoning, appealing to emotion, using personal language, anything like that. So we're, in writing our essay, taking a very specific stance. So let's look at the specific instructions they give us. Write an essay in which you explain how Jimmy Carter builds an argument to persuade his audience the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge should not be developed for industry. In your essay, and this is important, analyze how Carter uses one or more of the features listed in the box above, or features of your own choice, to strengthen the logic and persuasiveness of his argument. Be sure that your analysis focuses on the most relevant features of the passage. Your essay should not explain whether you agree with Carter's claims, but rather explain how Carter builds an argument to persuade his audience. So, two very important pieces that they included in there. We are talking about the persuasive elements of his discussion, and we are not talking about whether we agree or disagree. So, very important that your essay is solely an analysis of the way they write their essay and not whether they are correct or incorrect or whether you agree or disagree. So that can often be kind of a difficult thing to kind of correct if you get in a bad habit of responding to whether you agree or disagree in your essays. So this type of essay, practice is really important for two reasons. One, it's a specific kind of essay that maybe you don't have a lot of experience writing. So practicing identifying uses of evidence, identifying persuasive techniques, identifying reasoning and appeals to emotion in an essay. Using the examples they provide us from the College Board to practice those skills is really necessary. Additionally, you only have 50 minutes to write this essay. 50 minutes is a very short amount of time to write an essay. You have to read, you have to plan, and you have to write it and revise it in those 50 minutes. So being able to sit down and go for 50 minutes and get it done and have it in a presentation that you are comfortable with is something that is difficult to do for the first time on your exam day. So in general, a good kind of outline of timing to follow is to read for 5 minutes, plan for 5 minutes, write for 30 minutes, and revise for 5 minutes. So that only gets us to 45 minutes, but it kind of gives you some wiggle room if you go over. So you want to stick to this in general. So why is writing so much longer than our other portions? That's because structure counts the most in this exam. Well, two things, structure and also length. The SAT doesn't like to acknowledge it, but length plays a significant factor in your score. So you want to spend the most time you can just getting everything onto paper. A very neatly polished, perfectly punctuated, everything correctly spelled essay that isn't complete, that you ran out of time because you were editing it as you wrote, is going to do poorly. A kind of messy, a little bit sloppy, some incorrect spelling and punctuation essay that is very well structured and supported and has great evidence, it's going to do pretty well. So our steps of reading and planning, that's where we want to get all our evidence, get a good plan and a good structure. And our writing step is just putting that plan and taking that evidence and just getting it onto paper. If you don't have it completed, if you don't realize that structure and that organization in your essay, it's going to do pretty poorly because organization plays a really big role in your score. So practice, as I mentioned, very important. So this is something I like to work with my students on, of kind of building from step by step. So we work together. reading through a passage. What'd you see? Identifying the evidence, stuff like that. Making a plan. What makes a good essay structure? What should you reinforce in what parts of your essay? How should you discuss it? Moving on to the writing. Can you get it out in time? Are you writing using an appropriate tone? Are you using appropriate vocabulary? Are you being creative in your discussion? And revision, how to make changes. So going through that step by step, moving on to working under a time limit, moving on to doing it in one sitting under a time limit. So it takes practice to get all these steps to kind of meld together into one 50-minute sitting that you can be comfortable with. So it's really important to practice the essay. That amount of effort, if it isn't necessary to your application, I advise you don't do it. But if it is something you're interested in pursuing, it is absolutely something you can practice and improve on and be prepared for. So practice, obviously, on the other portions of the test is necessary as well. So practice, when you practice that test, you are going to gain experience. Practice leads to experience. Experience leads to confidence. Confidence leads to success. If you walk into that test having taken a practice test, you've taken that test one more time than everybody else, perhaps. There are currently, I believe, 10 full official College Board practice tests. That means you can walk into the door the day of your exam having already taken that exam 10 times. You can't buy that kind of confidence. Practicing the full exam is a great way to build that experience. So not only can you use it to practice the content, maybe you're not sure about, but you can also practice the conditions of the actual exam. Maybe you have a lot of difficulty taking exams under timed conditions. That's something you can practice at home and practice with your tutors. That's something I practice with my students because, as we've mentioned, time is such an important element here. So I like to work with my students practicing under the conditions of the exam. How do they reinforce things? How do they work those problem-solving strategies? How do they apply what we've discussed when the time crunch is on? So practice is really important for working under pressure. Practice is important so that you know how to apply your strategies in different scenarios. Practice is also important so you reinforce that content. Because maybe you were able to study something, memorize something, but once you see it in a testing scenario, it's not as familiar. So practice opens up these avenues where you can respond to the test and what it's going to throw at you in a more comfortable way. It's not as rigid if you have experience working with a tutor who can show you what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like, and so you can walk into that exam knowing how to respond and what it's going to be like on test day. So thank you for listening to my presentation. This is our Embrace Tutoring information. Here's a link to my tutor profile. If you are interested today, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you what you thought of the presentation, and also if you're interested in working going forward. Thank you for watching. I've also included some resources here for practice tests, discussion of math topics, writing and language in our reading section for you to look at independently as well. So thank you very much. I hope you all have a great day and happy holidays.